Joining us now is Nathan Hultman. He worked on the Paris Climate Agreement for the Obama administration. It was signed, of course, back in April 2016, and then President Trump pulled out of it. New York, not the only city in America who is taking measures. How successful are cities in the United States being in counteracting the kind of rollback of environmental protections and regulations that have happened under the Trump administration?
Well, cities are a really important part of that response to the Trump administration's change in attitude toward climate. And cities were, in fact, doing things even well before that, building some programs and policies that they could do to drive down their emissions, as we heard in that segment, but particularly on, for example, transportation and buildings, which are two specific areas that cities have some real control over. What
are the limits of cities' ability to tackle this problem? What do they still need the federal government to do?
Well, we are a federal system, and so we have this multiple layers of government in the United States. The federal government has certain policy levers. Certain levers are at the state level. For example, electricity policy, there's a lot that states can do, and cities have, as I mentioned before, a couple of levers that they can have influence over within their jurisdictions. Even businesses, for example, can do things in their own operations that can help. So the answer is that given the scale of what we know we need to do for climate change, cities are an essential and important part, and in fact, in many ways, are driving action today. But they're not the only solution. It has to really ultimately be all of the above working on this problem.
Give us some other examples of things that cities are doing. I mean, I've heard of things like, trying to change people's work hours so that people aren't all commuting at the same time, that kind of thing. What kind of innovative things are going on?
Well, there are just plenty of things. It all depends on the city context. But for example, on transportation, cities can have control over what they procure or what kinds of fleet they procure for their own operations. They can make commitments, for example, to buy renewable energy or go even 100% renewable energy. There have been a number of cities who have made commitments to go very high on renewable energy. They can do work on buildings. So, for example, doing benchmarking that can help the residents or the landlords of buildings know how to adjust their energy use, and often are seeing savings of 6 to 10%, even just with very little effort coming from those kinds of initiatives.
Nathan, I remember at the end of last year we had a big climate change conference in Bonn, and in fact the Americans brought quite a big delegation over. In fact, there were two rival delegations. There was the Trump administration, and obviously they had their input, but a huge delegation from the States, and the hashtag was "We're still in," which gets me thinking, if in 2020 Donald Trump isn't re-elected, how easy would it be for the United States to rejoin Paris?
Well, the United States is still not out of Paris technically, and so there's a lot of action going on. As you said, we are still in coalition. Within 72 hours after Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, we now have something like 3,000 actors, both cities, states, and businesses, and also others in the United States that have stepped up to say we are going to be working in our own jurisdictions, as you mentioned, to drive forward climate action in the ways that we can. What that means is that over the next couple of years, those actors are actually building the groundwork upon which a future federal policy can re-engage. And I think that that's one of the pieces of good news that we've seen over the last year, is that these actors are actually stepping up and then driving forward progress in the interim.
Nathan, of course, you worked for the Obama administration. Many things are political in this country. Is the tackling of climate change in cities one of those things? Are we seeing more Democratic cities take on climate change initiatives than we are Republicans, or is this a countrywide non-partisan issue?
I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I think what we see with a lot of these efforts is the more local you get, that the more people are acting, just sort of thinking about their own constituencies, their own interests. While there are many Democratic-leaning cities that are taking action, it's not just a Democratic and Republican issue. And I think a lot of times what we see is that a lot of these policies that are taken are policies that clean the air. They're potentially around improved land use, improved sort of quality of life for the residents, and it's the residents who are demanding those kinds of changes, and it's not really a left or right issue.
Okay, Nathan Hultman, thanks very much for coming in.